Okay, welcome back. So we are going to take a look at a sort of what is it like to be a worshiper in one of these ancient mythologies. And we talked about some of the things that make the Greeks unique, like their idea of such an insistence on like one god having a very specific identity and role. Um, and some of the various ways that they worship the gods. But there are a lot of things that we can learn from them that were true of a lot of these ancient forms of polytheism. Polytheism meaning, many gods, because originally that's the most common system, worshiping many gods. And so let's take a look at some of the ways that can work. So one thing about polytheistic mythologies that trips a lot of people up is that polytheistic mythologies lack a canon. So what does that mean exactly? Well, you think about something like Christianity, right? That's the sort of most familiar one in terms of popular culture and stuff like that. So in modern Christianity, there's this idea that there are correct texts that define what's true in a religion. And it's very important to know what's true, like in the Bible. So the Bible in Christianity, is supposed to be the accurate, useful thing that people use to understand what's important in the world. That isn't something you usually see in polytheistic mythologies. Now, they may have books that they consider sacred, or writings that they consider sacred, or even just stories like the myths that we're looking at that they consider sacred. But it's not so much about finding the accurate truth of things, because there are many different stories and they often contradict each other. Like today we're looking at Homer, next time we'll be looking at Hesiod. They talk about the same gods, they tell different stories about them. They may contradict each other completely. Some stories may say that Poseidon is a nice guy. Some may say that he's terrible, that he's a jerk. And so the thing is, in practical terms, that didn't matter so much because that wasn't what was important. What was important was the rituals that you did for the gods. So the way to think about it is kind of like this, that there are all these sort of forces in the universe. And you do know that like all sorts of crazy stuff can happen to you, especially if you're a farmer. Your crops might be in danger from the frost. They might be in danger from bandits. You might be traveling on the sea and be worried about the sea rising up and wrecking your boat or making you drown. All sorts of things like that could happen. So the idea of the gods is that they are the sort of entities that are in charge of all these things. And so you're kind of asking them mainly to be on your side. And the way you do that is by doing the rituals, doing the things that they want you to do. And you have to figure out what those are because the gods don't really communicate directly with human beings. So there's a level of sort of experimentation sometimes, but there's also a level of tradition. We do this ritual because our ancestors said it was what made Poseidon be nice to us. Okay, well, what if that stops working? What if you do the rituals and, Poseidon still wrecks your boat? Well, then clearly it's time for a new ritual. And you look around and you try some things that people say, please, Poseidon, until you finally find the ritual that works. And this is a kind of knowledge, or the Greeks think of it, and ancient cultures generally think of it as a kind of knowledge of how to make the gods pleased with you. That's something that gets passed down and is an important part of kind of culture and tradition. So that's part of why canon isn't important, because rituals are the thing to do. And we do know some things about, the different kinds of rituals that the cities would do. And in Greece, it was very city-based. It was like city by city, the cities are kind of independent entities, and they have their own rituals that they do at special times as like the whole city comes together. So that's part of what's different, say, from something like Christianity. We don't need to know whether the gods, did this or did that. We just need to know what makes them happy. There's also an aspect of pluralism to this, in that a polytheistic religion can much more easily incorporate new gods than a monotheistic religion. So it can say, oh yeah, well, you have this god Poseidon. Well, guess what? He's actually Zeus's brother. That's what we've decided. That's the sort of way that different gods can all become part of the same tradition. You see similar things in traditions like Hinduism, although Hinduism is more of a philosophical thing, that truth is one, but the sages speak of it by many names, that, the different perspectives are valid on the gods. And so, yeah, that's the thing, is we have some of these stories. We probably don't have all the stories that we would like. In fact, sometimes there are tantalizing hints that there may be stories that would be very interesting for us to have a chance to learn from, but we just get like a summary or something like that. Related to all this is the idea of syncretism. Because if you can easily incorporate other gods into your mythology, another thing you can do is see other people's gods as equivalent to your own. And this is known as syncretism, basically just meaning same belief. So believing the gods are in your different beliefs are the same. And so the Greeks almost did this in kind of an aggressive way. They would go around and they would find new cultures, and they would blur the lines between them and say, oh, when you say the goddess Isis, we're going to meet later on, she's really associated with nature, so that means she's the equivalent of Demeter. And then the Greeks would go around telling their friends, oh, hey, in Egypt they worship Demeter, which is, true maybe in a sense, but today we would not maybe want to blur those lines so much. But that's exactly what the Romans did with the Greeks. They just did a one-to-one syncretism comparison. And I think probably different Greek cities did it with each other's gods. And that's part of why the stories would vary so widely, and why the way the gods acted could vary so much. And that does seem to be a pretty common thing in polytheistic mythology. But the Greeks took it to a very philosophical level. And a big part of ritual is sacrifice. A lot of cultures have some sort of tradition around sacrificing something to the gods, usually an animal. So the idea as commonly practiced, as we see in India and Greece, is that you sacrifice like an animal and then you cook and eat the meat. And that's part of the ritual as well. That's part of the whole process. So the gods eat the sort of scent of the meat, and they eat like the bones and the parts that human beings don't want when they decay. And then human beings get to eat cooked meat, and that's pretty fun. And this would be a big deal because most people didn't get a whole lot of protein in their diet. So if the city is having this big barbecue, effectively, it's a really good way to worship the gods, and B, really good news for you. Another thing you can do is give the god some kind of offering. This is very popular, especially among the wealthy. Yeah, you would make a statue and give it to the god. Sometimes you would make a statue of the god, or sometimes you would make a statue of yourself and say, hey, I'm here with you, I'm your buddy, I'm going to stay in your temple now. Something along those lines. And this one is a statue of possibly Athena, or possibly a priestess of Athena. That's the other thing. The priests and priestesses would sometimes kind of take on the identities of the gods to some extent. Not saying they actually were the gods, but that they were kind of representing them. For instance, it was teenage girls who were supposed to be priestesses of Athena. And then when they grew up and got married, then they would become like priestesses of Demeter or something like that, of the more married gods. But as a young girl, to be a young girl in an important family and chosen as the priestess of Athena for that particular year was a pretty big deal. You can also notice here that Greek statues would originally have been painted, which is something that a lot of people don't know, but I just figured I'd let you guys know. It's a very different aesthetic than we think of when we think of Greek statues. Let's see, and we kind of talked about city-based religion already. As the young women are associated with be priests and be priestesses of the goddesses, the young men are priests of the gods, quite frequently Apollo. And so you can see that there's different gods that you're a priest or priestess of for different genders and different age levels. And also notice that, it's not like a thing where you just have one god your whole life long. That's something that a lot of fantasy stories kind of get wrong. People say that you are just a worshiper of one god. I think that's honestly a kind of video gamey role play type thing. But in actuality, people could be worshipers of many gods and would change what official role that they had. That's the other thing too, is a priest is not something, Today, a priest, that's your whole job description. In ancient times, that would be a role that you would play during a certain time in your life. So that's coming from my sort of knowledge of Greece and my biases in knowing that perspective really particularly well. But I do think a lot of these same concepts, especially sacrifice and syncretism and pluralism, apply to other traditions as well. Now, when we look outside Greece, we see some variations in what people can do. In Hinduism, one thing that you can give to the gods is food or decorations. So you decorate the statue. Sometimes you pour milk or honey on the statue itself, and the statue is said to sort of house the presence of the god. And this is still very much practiced today. And you give food to the god, usually eaten by the priests and priestesses, but sort of in respect to the gods. Somehow or other, you gotta, show some kind of gift to the gods. It can get very brutal, as we see in Aztec culture. In ancient Aztec mythology, there's an idea that if you do not give the gods human sacrifice, the sun will burn out. And this is actually, the sun is actually burned out 4 times before. So this is a duty that people want to take seriously. Now, that said, it wasn't something people did 24/7. It was usually enemy warriors from regions that were being conquered. And you've got to imagine it was pretty intimidating. But this was one way of interpreting that, is this idea of human sacrifice instead of animal sacrifice. Now, the Greeks were horrified by human sacrifice. They did not like it. So they said the gods would be really offended if you tried to sacrifice a human to them. So one almost wonders if there was a time period in Greece where they actually did do that, but we haven't found any evidence for it yet. Another thing that we can do, and I apologize for not having a slide on this, but we can have ancestor worship. You can worship sort of the spirit of your family. And we see this in China, and we see this in parts of the Americas as well. Just sort of looking back to these spirits of those who are gone are watching over you. In Greece, it tends to be the spirits of the dead are just in the underworld. So there's a variety of different things here, but hopefully that gives us a sense of some of the different perspectives. The other thing to mention is that a lot of traditions also have a concept of some sort of lesser spirits or, lesser gods. Some cultures, it's like everything is on an equal level. Everything is a god. We see that in Japan, and the line between god and a spirit is blurred. But in some cultures like Greece, we see there's clearly gods, but there are also beings that are less powerful. And in Greece, these were known as the daimons. This is actually where we get the word demon, when later Christians reinterpret this to be a bad thing. But in Greece, one common idea was that everybody had their own sort of daimon, this spirit that was kind of like their guardian angel. And when they, in Greek, when they say you're happy, they say you're eudaimon, you have a good daimon. In Rome, they have a similar concept, which is the noumena, that there are sort of spirits that lurk in various places, and they are also worthy of respect, as well as the gods. So yeah, there's a sense of the world is just full of all sorts of interesting entities who you just mainly you want to have them on your side. And then telling stories about them, that's the question, how does this turn into mythology? One scholar had the idea that it all started with the rituals, and then they built up mythology to explain the rituals. Today, we don't think that's true so much, but it was maybe, things that kind of go hand in hand. Sometimes you do a ritual because there's a particular story about the ritual. Poseidon was offended by this. And then he said, this is how you make it up to me. And so every year we give Poseidon, 3 cows because he told us that's what he likes, something along those lines. So it's interesting to wonder, how do we get into the realm of mythology? And I think maybe one reason is just that we need ways to sort of latch on to these gods. We need to give them personality and character. And there have been a lot of creative storytellers over the years, sometimes in a literary way, sometimes in a more sort of experimental or just telling stories around the fire, oral storytelling sort of way to tell stories about the gods. And there's almost like 2 ways to experience the gods. One is the way we experience them, which is reading the stories. The other is to do the rituals for them and to have them be this big, important part of your life. Okay, so we've covered some good things there. Next, what I want to move into is some of the stories that I had you guys look at. So in the next video, we'll talk about some famous stories for Greek mythology and also find out if they can tell us maybe a little bit about history. Can mythology tell us about history? That'll be our question. So I'll see you guys in that video.